To paraphrase a Tony Award winner, we imagine death so much it feels more like a memory. When will it get thee? In your sleep? Or 7 feet ahead of thee? If you see it coming, do you run, or do you let it be? In the years that I've been reviewing film, and in the short amount of time in which I've been doing this series, I've come to an understanding about horror as a genre. It is a genre in which we can explore darker aspects of human nature and the world at large, without those aspects and the repercussions thereof spilling over into our normal life. Oftentimes, in well-crafted horror, we like to explore aspects that we often restrain or repress, usually due to societal obligation. However, one other aspect we like to explore in horror is the feeling of helplessness, of having no control, no plan, no one to help you, only you, the clothes on your back, what items you have in your pocket, and what little relevant knowledge is swirling around in your head amidst the cold sweat and the adrenaline as you come face to face with horrifying elements that intend to end your life, be they mundane or supernatural. As technology evolved, we've gone from exploring these concepts around a campfire to the written page, whether you're reading those words in your own home or are memorizing them for the purpose of acting in front of others. Then came the evolution of motion picture, where we were better able to direct and misdirect the audience and control what we wanted them to see. Between various gimmicks like 3D, smell-o-vision, or even multiple endings that are decided by an audience or even just shown in different movie theaters, it was only natural that horror would move to a medium that thrives on interactivity. No longer are we merely hoping that the main character survives their predicament. It is in our power to ensure that they do so. So, when you find yourself trapped in a mysterious mansion in the Midwestern United States, surrounded by a menagerie of biological horrors with the intent to end your life, do you surrender to the monster's icy gaze, or do you refuse to let it end as a dream? Representing the old, we have the 1996 PlayStation game Resident Evil, produced by Capcom. Representing the new, we have the 2002 remake, originally released for the Nintendo GameCube. Now, for the sake of disclosure, this won't exactly be a one-to-one comparison. For the sake of this review, we'll be specifically looking at the director's cut version of the original and the HD remaster of the remake. The reasons for this are primarily due to the fact that these were the versions I was able to obtain, as finding copies of the original releases of both titles would have taken a great deal of time and a greater deal of money that I do not have. However, I feel that this is somewhat justified, as the director's cut is the only version available on the PlayStation Network, and the HD remaster is more widely accessible across multiple platforms. On top of that, the director's cut has features that were left out of the original Western release, but present in the original Japanese release, such as the auto-aim mechanic. To keep the comparison as fair as possible, I played through the remaster at its original aspect ratio with its original control scheme, as that made it easier for me to transition between the two games. Now, this won't be a mechanical analysis of these two games. We're not going to focus on the improved graphics or the faster loading times. We're instead going to focus on how each of these games are presented as a horror experience. With that said, let us begin with round 1. The stories of the two games are virtually identical, save for a few differences here and there. They both start with the setup of the STARS Alpha team journeying into the Arklay Mountains in search of Bravo team, who had gone in to investigate a series of bizarre murder cases that occurred in the outskirts of Raccoon City, a fictional town in the Midwestern United States. They both also feature the possibility of either choosing to play as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, who each have unique abilities and unique encounters. So, which tells the better tale? For this video, I played through each game twice, first as Jill and then as Chris. I didn't have enough time to go through and get all of the endings of the respective games, so we'll be taking a look at how the story is presented when obtaining the true ending, where your partner survives, and you're able to rescue the imprisoned member of STARS, which is the opposite player character from the one you've chosen. Both games start out the same way, with an opening narration by Chris Redfield, who explains the basic premise. While the footage differs in quality, as well as color, both sequences follow the exact same story beats, with the dialogue from the original game being reused almost verbatim in the remake. The intro cutscene is a bit longer in the latter, as they add more gore and violence to better establish the threat the Cerberus, the in-universe name for the zombie dogs, pose to the STARS unit as we see Joseph Frost get torn limb from limb, something that more or less happens off-screen in the original due to censorship. As for the scope of this opening scene, it's a clear night and day difference as to which version had more money and manpower behind it, since the mansion is revealed in the original using computer graphics and the dogs are merely hand puppets. That said, it adds to the campy charm and makes it feel closer to the low-budget horror films that inspired it. While we all love to laugh at the stilted movements and weird line choices, when you consider that the original was going to have a Japanese dub, it suddenly makes sense why some lines felt so out of place and odd, likely directed to act that way for the benefit of the voice actors who would later dub them over. One key difference between the two games also changes the way the tone is set for the experience as a whole, particularly when you're playing as Chris as opposed to Jill. In the original, when you play as Chris, at the end of the intro when the members of STARS enter the mansion, you get one final bit of narration from Chris explaining how there are only 3 members left: Jill, Wesker, and himself, with Barry's whereabouts unknown before we're given the cast roll call. When you choose to play as Jill, however, this bit of dialogue is missing, with the cast roll call beginning almost immediately, which leaves the sequence feeling kind of jarring. Fortunately, this is something that the remake fixes by creating unique cutscenes for each character and doing away with the roll call, which makes the experience more consistent between the two campaigns, as opposed to the original where Chris is clearly billed as the main character. Now that we've covered the introduction, let us shift into the story proper. Now, this isn't going to be a breakdown of every single cutscene, because this video would never be finished otherwise, especially when you consider that, as I stated, the stories play out in almost the same exact way, save for a few key differences. And I'm not just talking about the changes in voice acting or dialogue that try to make the characters sound more human. The first difference is in Chris's campaign where you meet Rebecca. In the original, you find her in the eastern save room where she ambushes you with a spray of random chemicals. After this exchange, you can choose to have Rebecca join you in your investigation. While she doesn't literally tag along, it more or less gives her permission to appear in other parts of the mansion. Whereas if you say no, she'll remain in that save room and can heal you if you're injured, allowing you to conserve items. In the remake, you meet Rebecca in the corridor leading up to the first major boss battle of the game, the Yawn, aka the giant zombie snake. Here, she's tending to Richard Aiken, a fellow member of Bravo Team. Unlike the original, you do not really get a choice in whether or not she tags along, at least not in the same way. Here, it seems to be more contingent on whether or not you give Richard the serum for the snake poison, something you don't get to do in the original as he's already dead by the time you find him. You also take control of her briefly after first facing the Yawn in both versions in order to obtain the same serum for Chris, a segment that tends to be forgettable if you're the kind of player who clears out the mansion as you move through it. She'll also perform the function of healing you when you are in the mansion, but only for the duration of the initial exploration, and during a brief moment in the residence after you've defeated Plant 42. Speaking of which, if you let Rebecca tag along in the original, she'll help you in your battle against Plant 42 by mixing the V-Jolt, which will severely weaken the plant and make the battle much easier, provided that you've read the file describing the chemical before you go in to face the plant. In the remake, however, at least based on my playthrough, she doesn't assist with the battle and instead meets you outside the room after you've beaten it. As for Jill's campaign, Barry more or less performs the same role in both games, occasionally aiding you in encounters and providing you with items and weapons. However, while in the original he seemingly appears as an all-too-coincidental savior, with the explanation provided by Wesker in the game's final moments, in the remake they play up his betrayal of STARS as in later parts of the game he takes deliberate action to have Jill killed. One consistent difference the remake has from the original is with the character of Richard Aiken. In the original, you can attempt to save him as Jill by giving him the serum, only for him to still die after he gives you the radio. However, in the remake, saving Richard actually has a little bit of payoff, albeit tragically. Spoilers much? If you give Richard the serum in Jill's story and then go to face the Yawn, Richard will join you in the battle, taking shots at him with his assault shotgun, which comes in handy if you simply want to run and grab the death mask and shotgun shells without battling it. After it goes down briefly, Richard sacrifices himself to save Jill, getting eaten whole. If you manage to save him as Chris, you'll find him in the Aqua Ring, where he again pushes you out of the way as another big bad, this time the Neptune, aka a giant zombie shark, eats him whole. No matter what you do, he is doomed to be dinner for some sort of bioorganic monstrosity. After his death in both campaigns, you're given access to his assault shotgun, so at the very least, you're still rewarded for trying to save your comrade. It was in Chris's campaign, however, that Richard's death seemed to have some actual weight, as both Chris and Rebecca actually get pretty torn up after his death, seen after beating Plant 42. Chris tells Rebecca what happened and beats himself up over his death, feeling responsible for him as a member of Alpha Team, especially when you consider that the whole goal of the mission, or so he thought, was to rescue the members of Bravo Team. This is followed up by another scene where you can have Rebecca treat your wounds in the mixing lab of the residence, where you see Rebecca break down, the trauma of all that's happened no doubt taking its toll on her. That's not to say the original is without these moments of development, they are just fewer and further between, as the overall dramatic arc of Chris and Rebecca is communicated through the game's mechanics and how they inform the story, rather than through a particular cutscene. You still have Chris trying to present himself as the capable senior of the two, but you also see numerous moments where he has to rely on Rebecca to survive, whether it's her playing the piano to solve a puzzle, bringing the serum after he's been bit by the Yawn, mixing the V-Jolt when he's captured by Plant 42, and activating the self-destruct system at the end of the game. If I had to summarize the overall arcs of Chris's story, I'd say that the original tells the story of a lone wolf who's used to going it alone and brute forcing his way through, learning to rely on others who are more methodical and less impulsive, which you see in Rebecca as a character, someone who is perceived to be weak and helpless, but is actually able to pull her own weight when the situation calls for it. With the remake, on the other hand, it becomes less about Chris learning to rely on others and more an exploration of the burden of leadership, of putting on a brave face in a stressful situation and trying to be a source of strength and comfort for the other members of your team. You see this early on in the introduction when Chris saves Jill from getting attacked by a Cerberus and even braces himself for an attack with Jill behind him in the hopes that she will get away. That said, you don't really see much in the terms of character growth for Chris in the remake, but rather an exploration of who he already is. As for the arc of Jill's campaign, there isn't as much there in either version, as both mechanically and narratively, she's presented as fully competent and capable. She's clearly a more methodical operative of STARS, best demonstrated by her ability to pick locks, which is something that actually takes a fair bit of time to get even remotely good at. On top of that, she can play piano and knows how to mix chemicals. As such, there isn't really an arc she goes through beyond simply solving the mystery of the mansion. Looking at her relationship with Barry, it comes across less as a senior officer interacting with a junior, and more like they are on an even playing field. They're both aware of each other's strengths and seem to demonstrate a level of mutual respect, no doubt the result of numerous missions together. This is something the remake improves upon by actually putting a twist on that relationship, as the seeds of doubt are slowly planted and finally come to a head when she confronts Barry about his betrayal of STARS. Speaking of betrayal, at the center of this conspiracy, we have the character of Albert Wesker, leader of the Alpha Team and the STARS unit as a whole. In the original, he's barely present in the game save for a few key moments: the beginning where you first enter the mansion, a brief interlude at the guardhouse, and the ending where it's revealed that he's the one behind everything. It could be argued that it's almost intentional, that he was busy manipulating things in the shadows, with the initial revelation of his involvement being discovered by the player through various files and documents, seeded further when you encounter Enrico in the underground caverns, who states that there's a traitor in their midst and that Umbrella is involved. This scene is especially interesting in Chris's story, as Enrico gets ready to shoot Chris, assuming him to be the traitor, which raises the question of who put the idea in his head and what kind of relationship Chris had with the members of Bravo Team prior to the events of the game. This was another improvement in the remake, as we got to see more moments in which you saw just how much of a manipulator he is. In Jill's story, you see him stoke the flames of mistrust between Jill and Barry, hoping that they will eventually turn on each other and save him the work of dispatching them. While this was limited in Chris's campaign, what moments you did see more or less tried to frame him in the same role that Barry performed for Jill, leaving you ammo, fixing the broken doorknob near the Western save room, and even fighting alongside you. The interactions between Chris and Wesker also give an impression of what their working relationship might have been. They still have a clear hierarchical relationship, but it also shows that there was the same mutual respect, at least from Chris's perspective. This is especially poignant when Wesker praises Chris for his efforts at the end of the game before revealing his plans. So now we've come to the biggest difference between the two games. This was an idea that Mikami wanted in the original, but had to cut it out due to the limitations of the PlayStation's hardware. Some aspects of it work, others I take issue with. I am of course talking about the tragedy of the Trevor family. In the remake, you uncover a series of pages from a diary kept by George Trevor, the architect who designed the Spencer Mansion back in the 60s. Through these pages, you're given hints about some of the puzzles and learn of his ultimate fate upon the mansion's completion. At first, I thought this was just a nice bit of world building, something that fleshed out the history of the mansion, but wasn't really necessary to understand the story. That all changes when you leave the mansion and begin making your way into the courtyard. While in the original you find the crank in the first room after unlocking the door to the courtyard, in the remake they've added a whole extra area to explore in order to obtain the crank. The sequence starts out promising enough, with either Barry or Wesker, depending on who you're playing, trying to call you on the radio to warn you of a creature in chains that's impervious to bullets, warning you to stay away from the woods outside the mansion, the very area you're having to explore. As you go deeper into the woods, you hear the rattle of chains on the wind as you move through the area, eventually coming across a cabin with a typewriter and item box. Going further in, you find the crank in the back room. Upon grabbing it, you hear the door open. As you go check, you see something run towards the fireplace from the door, and as you head in the same direction, you are then knocked unconscious. Once you come to, you come face to face with the creature itself. Design-wise, it looks okay, not particularly frightening, but it does the job of looking imposing. Knowing that it's impervious to guns, your only option is to put as much distance between you and the creature as possible. As such, you take the crank back with you and continue on through the game. If you look at some of the files in the cabin, you find some notes that appear to be written by a child that is looking for its mother, implying that the creature was once human. Fast forward to after your second battle with the Yawn, and you find yourself exploring the underground caverns where you encounter Enrico. After restoring power to the elevator, you go deeper underground and find yourself in an area with a trash compactor. In Jill's story, you hear a noise, with Barry telling you to go and investigate. In Chris's mode, you don't really hear such a noise and can only really go in because the elevator breaks and there's no other way out. You find yourself in a labyrinthian cavern, and who should you find again? The creature in chains. As she chases you around, you're able to stun her after hitting her enough times, but only so you can get away and solve the puzzle, which involves loading a box on a transport device, crushing said box in the trash compactor, grabbing the broken flamethrower that was inside, running back into the cavern, pulling a lever, and placing the flamethrower on a rack to unlock the door. After exploring the following area, you uncover more files that reveal that not only was the architect George Trevor trapped within the mansion, his wife Jessica and daughter Lisa were also taken prisoner by Umbrella and experimented upon, with Lisa being the only survivor who now roams the grounds as the creature in chains. The subplot reaches its climax in the next section, as the object you find allows you to unlock a door that is beneath the stairs in the main hall of the mansion, leading to another underground area, this time an altar-like area with a stone coffin that is surrounded by 4 stone pillars. Here is where you encounter Lisa Trevor for the final time. You can choose to either wear her down with your weapons and force her to the edge, or you can end the fight quickly by pushing the stone statues off the platform, which prompts the coffin to slide open, revealing the body of Jessica Trevor, now fully decayed. This prompts Lisa to take her mother's skull and jump into the abyss. If you open the coffin, you'll find a file inside that is a letter written to Lisa by Jessica, advising her of a plan to escape that never came to fruition. So ends the tale of the Trevor family. To be honest, I am not a big fan of this subplot. It started out strongly, but what it led to just simply amounted to another demonstration of how awful the Umbrella Corporation is, which we already knew. To its credit, I feel it works better in Jill's story than it does in Chris's story, as it directly feeds into her confrontation with Barry. He first radios Jill to warn her of the creature, then leaves her to die in the underground cavern by taking the elevator back up. And it's in the chamber where you face Lisa for the final time that she confronts Barry, taking away his gun and giving the player the choice to either give it back to him or not, as Lisa begins rampaging into the room. While I went for the best ending and gave the gun back, if you don't, it actually makes for a fitting moment of karmic retribution, as the very creature he expected to kill Jill is the one who does him in. In Chris's mode, on the other hand, it just feels tacked on and doesn't add anything to the story. He's not abandoned underground during the second encounter, the elevator just breaks down conveniently. And while Wesker joins you during the third encounter, his interactions after the battle don't really add anything. It probably would have made more sense if she was the one trying to kill Rebecca instead of the hunter, because then at least there would have been a reason to actually care about the battle beyond it simply being the obstacle between you and the laboratory. Overall, this subplot makes the story feel like it was padded out to make the experience longer. I liked the first part with George Trevor's diary entries, but it felt like Mikami was really banking on Lisa Trevor having some sort of lasting impact on the game as a whole. In the end, she simply came across as just another monster for you to outrun. Despite this, it's easy to see which version tells the better story. Yes, the original has its goofy B-movie charm, but the remake does a lot more for the sake of character development. While the story does take itself a little too seriously, and you do lose out on the mechanical theming, it's a more complete experience that better endears you to the plight of the characters and the horrors that they face within the mansion. As such, this round goes to the new. Now that we've covered the story, let us take a look at how each game terrifies you with its locations as we move into round 2. While this may not be a fair comparison considering the hardware limitations of the original PlayStation, the original managed to work around those limitations with a few interesting design choices. One of the first aspects of Resident Evil most people remember is the fixed camera angles. While they emerged out of necessity in order to position the pre-rendered backgrounds properly, the developers used them as an opportunity to heighten the tension of the game by choosing what the player could see at any given moment. This made entering some areas unnerving, as you couldn't even see what was ahead of you until you actually stepped forward. They could make certain areas feel claustrophobic, call attention to important puzzle elements, or even add some cinematic flourishes to the scenery. It left you feeling like you were almost watching everything through a security camera, the action being distant from you, as though you were merely an observer, powerless to help the characters as they fight for their lives. Another iconic aspect of design was the use of opening doors as the loading screens. Whenever you entered from one room to another, especially if it was a room you hadn't explored yet, it would create this sense of tension. You didn't know what could be on the other side of the room. Could it be zombies, dogs, or maybe a boss? All you could do was wait as the door opened and you went inside. This was especially tense as you went up and down the stairs, as from the lower levels you had no way of knowing what awaited you up top, or what waited for you below as you went down. As you heard each thud, you felt this sense of cautiousness, like the characters were bracing themselves with every single step. Despite the hardware limitations, the people making this game took great care to make sure that the settings carried their own sense of dread. Whether through lighting effects on the pre-rendered backgrounds, text descriptions of the decayed items within the mansion, or simple choices in sound design. Honestly, the strongest moments that were the most eerie were usually those where there was barely any music, only the sound effects, which could either be crickets in the distance, or the sounds of enemies waiting for you just off screen. That said, the game was not above the use of jump scare tactics. Some were clearly scripted encounters, while others emerged as a result of enemy design. A few of the jump scare moments, such as the Cerberus crashing through the windows, made many first-time players jump. Others, like this hunter who slides out in front of you, come across as a bit more comedic. However, this speaks to the intelligence of the hunters as opposed to the zombies, who are merely shambling corpses. There are also a few moments in the game that build up suspense through more traditional means, and that is through pre-rendered cutscenes. There's of course the first zombie, which is arguably one of the most iconic cutscenes in the history of gaming. After sitting through what was effectively a straight-to-video B-movie, this was the first time you encountered something that could actually be considered scary. You turn the corner and find a creature hunched over something, which then unleashes a pool of blood, only for the creature to turn its head, revealing its scaly white skin and very human-like eye turning towards you, its mouth covered in blood. This sets the tone of the experience far more effectively than the entirety of the intro cutscene. Building on this idea, we have the first reveal of the Hunter, which runs through the courtyard, leaps up the broken elevator shaft, and runs through the very rooms and halls you were just in as you made your way back to the mansion, all before opening the door to the very hallway that you're in. It's an effective moment of build-up that establishes the new enemy that you have to face throughout your second visit to the mansion. You can trigger a similar cutscene when you're in the basement of the mansion, whether you're playing as Chris, or as Jill if you don't wait for Barry to lower a rope to you after the second battle with the Yawn. In the cutscene, a zombie comes down the stairs that leads to the kitchen right as you're about to open the door. Lastly, there's the reveal of the Tyrant, a creature that is built up to be the ultimate life form. Its hulking, massive body, complete with an oversized heart beating outside its chest, a long, massive claw on its arm, all floating in suspended animation, just waiting to be unleashed. With all of these elements in place, you have a game that, for its time, was quite a terrifying experience. At least the first time through. Sadly, like an M. Night Shyamalan film, once you know all the twists and turns, subsequent playthroughs can get kind of boring. This is why the director's cut includes an arrange mode, and also why the most coveted item in the game, the infinite rocket launcher, can only be obtained if you beat the game in under 3 hours. This is a trait that is shared with the remake, which seeks to improve upon the elements of the original, thanks in large part to the graphical capabilities of the GameCube, and the larger budget the team was afforded, since Resident Evil was now an established brand for Capcom. The game retains the fixed camera angles and adds further cinematic flourishes that take it from feeling like you're watching it on a security camera to making it look like you're watching a film. There are even some moments in the game where the camera angles are made to be intentionally jarring, leaving you feeling kind of disoriented. On top of that, the game also makes effective use of lighting effects, with some hallways being left entirely in shadow, save for whatever light comes in from the other room or from the occasional crashes of thunder. This is used to great effect in areas where zombies are able to burst through windows, with the silhouette of the zombie being cast on the wall as you walk past. Another major improvement was how the mansion was made to look even more decayed and abandoned, with the wallpaper torn in places and blood smeared on the walls and doors. It makes the whole thing look derelict, which greater sells the idea that the sudden outbreak of the T-virus caught many of the people living here off guard. You also have newer areas of the game that take influence from other horror films that balance the use of lighting and sound design to create an eerie atmosphere. As for the special cutscenes, they are more or less shot-for-shot remakes of the ones from the original, with the only major addition being the reveal of the Neptune. As such, there's not really too much to comment on here. The same could pretty much be said for the rest of the remake's approach to atmosphere, since it uses the same door loading screens and even some of the same exact fixed angles as the original. That said, there are some moments where the game plays around with your expectations. Upon returning to the mansion a second time, you'll find certain areas where the doors have burst open, broken down by the hunters now roaming the mansion. This results in certain areas suddenly becoming seamless as you go through them a second time. It was an interesting take on how the mansion can change in even a short amount of time, marking a real sense of progression. Speaking of which, one mechanic that also heightens the tension is that the zombies can now follow you from room to room. You thought you were safe after outrunning a zombie? Think again. If you wander around near a door that leads to an area where you've just encountered a zombie, the door will rattle as though it's trying to get through. If you're in the area with the rattling door long enough, the zombie on the other side will come through to pursue you. To my knowledge, only normal zombies are able to do this, but not any of the other monsters. Thank God. If there was something I had to complain about with the remake, it would be the lack of differences between the two campaigns regarding certain details. While it's a minor nitpick, this is something they managed to accomplish in the original that they failed to replicate. When you go into the dining room in Jill's story, she and Barry come across a pool of blood, wondering out loud if it might have come from Chris. This is something you see in both versions. However, in the original, when you play as Chris, the pool of blood isn't there, confirming that in Jill's story, it is Chris's blood. However, in the remake, the blood is present in Chris's story, but the game doesn't really acknowledge it. You can't examine it, nor is there a line speculating whether or not it might be Barry's blood, or if it came from Kenneth, the Bravo team member who's being eaten in the reveal of the first zombie. Now I know what you're thinking, this is such a minor detail, but when you consider the other aspects of the game the developers put attention to, such as having certain files change depending on whether or not you encounter Barry in certain rooms, or even triggering specific cutscenes after following certain flags, you'd think just a text description acknowledging it could have been worked in. Sadly, this is commonly the result of having highly detailed backgrounds and elements that are rendered in real time, as it makes it harder to switch things out due to the number of resources required. Whereas in the original, the pre-rendered backgrounds aren't as detailed, so small elements like this could be switched out very easily. Another mild complaint would be with the title screen. When you boot up the original, you see a full motion video of Chris's actor being chased, ending on a close-up of his eye before the title of the game appears. It's quick, it's intense, and it catches your attention and clues you in on what you're getting into. What does the remake do? Well, we get a shot of some nondescript derelict laboratory where a zombie slowly rises up from a body bag before getting shot in the head and falling back down. Fade to black. You then get a still image for the title screen. It's okay, I guess, but it's not really as eye-catching or even as interesting. Looking at these two games side by side, it's clear which one had the advantage of both technology and budget. The original made do with the hardware it had and delivered some pretty solid frights. The remake, on the other hand, took those same elements and gave them a serious upgrade, despite those two gripes that I mentioned. As such, this round once again goes to the new. So now we come to the one aspect that is unique to this medium: how the games play. This is round 3. Like I've said before, the games are virtually identical. That said, the remake works in some new ideas that inject new life into the experience. That said, let us begin by discussing the major commonalities between the two. One of the other aspects of Resident Evil most people remember are the tank controls. To those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, in order to navigate the game, you have to turn your character in a specific direction by pushing left or right, and then you push up or down to move them either forwards or backwards, with the latter being considerably slower and only done to back away from enemies. While a lot of people may not like these controls, for a game that is meant to make you feel powerless and afraid, they serve their purpose, as they make you have to move cautiously through your surroundings and can make getting away from enemies a real challenge. The other benefit of the control system, at least with this game, is that when you move from one area of a room to another, you don't have to reorient your directional input when the camera angle changes, which is incredibly handy for boss battles or moments where you're trying to outrun a monster. Now, there's one thing I have to mention for newer players who are looking to get into the game, and I may be in the minority when I say this, but tank controls work best when using the D-pad. If you try playing with an analog stick, at least in my experience, you run into the problem of veering slightly as you run, which can cause you to have to constantly reorient yourself, or to get snagged on walls or objects in the middle of tense situations, particularly with puzzles that require you to move quickly. Seriously, whoever thought it was a good idea to work in a timed puzzle that requires you to run and turn sharply into a game with tank controls is either a colossal idiot or a colossal sadist. As for how the tank controls factor into combat, when you're not placing your faith in the auto-aim mechanic, you rotate around like a clock to aim your weapon. Even with the auto-aim, it's quite easy to miss, especially if you're aiming at something off-screen. This is especially applicable when you're using the knife, as it doesn't take much for an enemy to grab you and chip at your health. It's here where we see the first difference between the two games. In the original, there's no way to really break free beyond just mashing the buttons. In the remake, you're given the option to equip and use defensive weapons. You can either have them set to be used automatically, or deploy them manually at the push of a button, which I would recommend, as much like the other items in this game, they are a finite resource. Both characters get the dagger, but Jill is able to use the stun gun, while Chris gets the flash grenade. The benefit of the flash grenade is that if you use them on an enemy, it results in an automatic decapitation after 10 seconds, but you can also shoot the enemy to detonate it if you're impatient. Why mention decapitation? Well, that has to do with the remake's other new mechanic. In the original, if you killed a zombie and left the area, it would disappear. In the remake, on the other hand, the bodies will remain where you left them. Why? Allow me to introduce the Crimson Head. If you kill a zombie and leave the body alone for a set period of time, depending on the difficulty, the zombie will come back stronger, faster, and will be far more aggressive. How do you stop the zombies from reanimating as Crimson Heads? There are two ways. First, you can destroy the head. Using the handgun, you can occasionally score a critical hit that will blow off their head, but the odds are really low. A more reliable method is to use the shotgun. As the enemies come close, you point the gun upwards towards their head and fire, blowing their head off instantly. This was something you could do in the original game to conserve ammo, especially on Chris's playthrough where you only get the shotgun and the magnum. However, at least in my experience, it doesn't seem to work as consistently in the remake. Sometimes you're able to do it, other times it just hits them like a normal attack. The second method? You incinerate their bodies after defeating them. When you enter the Western save room with the gardening tools, you find a fuel canteen that you can fill with kerosene. The deposits of kerosene can be found in specific areas of the game. However, you can't just burn every creature as you go, as it is also a finite resource. Once you've used up all the kerosene in a tank, that's it. You have to find another one in another area, or you have to do without. This gives you an added incentive to avoid enemies rather than killing them, since not only do you need to conserve your ammo, you also have to conserve your kerosene and your inventory space. Playing as Chris, you have the lighter as a special item independent from the rest of your inventory, but Jill, on the other hand, has to carry both the lighter and the fuel canteen. This is something you can sidestep in Jill's story if you use the grenade launcher with the incendiary rounds, as one shot will immediately take down a zombie and ensure they won't come back. Most of the time. As for my thoughts on the new additions, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, they make the experience fresh for veteran players of the franchise, and further encourages you to conserve ammo as you move through the mansion. On the other hand, though, it feels like the game was artificially inflating its own difficulty, thereby making it seem harder than it actually is arbitrarily. It left me wondering why mechanics like the idea of the Crimson Heads couldn't have been just another difficulty level like Real Survival or Arrange mode. Not to mention that by the time you get to the end of the game, that mechanic is largely irrelevant. The inclusion of defensive weapons, while an interesting idea, comes across as Capcom wanting to have it both ways, where the game is both harder and easier at the same time, like they couldn't decide which way they wanted to go. It doesn't help that the game straight up lies to you about the difficulty when you first start it. When starting a new game, you're given a questionnaire that asks you how you like your games. There are 3 options, so naturally you think the choices correspond with the most common difficulty settings: easy, normal, and hard. So, I chose the middle setting, only to find out upon beating the game that I was playing on easy, and that the difficulty below was very easy, which means that the top option that most people would assume is hard mode is actually normal mode. When I discovered this, I had to play through the game all over again 2 more times to ensure that I had gone through on the correct mode. You'd think if they wanted to insult players for choosing easy or otherwise discourage them, they'd have Chris or Jill wear a baby bonnet and pacifier for added punishment. In the original, the difficulty setting was straightforward. You could choose original or beginner mode. And even in original mode, the overall difficulty was dictated by which character you chose. There was no real deception here, not unless you count the training mode cheat, but even then, it doesn't lie to you about the difficulty. Speaking of which, when it comes to the overall difficulty, even the easy mode can be pretty overwhelming, particularly when you consider the number of enemies present within the mansion at the start of the game. There are even scripted encounters where you can have as many as 4 zombies crowding a hallway at any given time. And that's not even considering the terror of the Crimson Heads. This led to the game feeling like it was taking every opportunity to rattle you, but in a very cheap way, like a horror movie with nothing but jump scares. The strange thing is that this is only during the first part of the game. Once you've made it to the residence, it seems to show you some sort of mercy. as you only have to deal with a set number of enemies that remain consistent across difficulties. To make matters worse, or better, most of the zombies you've avoided are mostly gone upon your return, likely killed by the hunters. As a whole, the remake tries to make itself as hard as possible when you're playing on normal difficulty, and even the lower difficulty levels try to overwhelm you when you're first exploring the mansion, only for the game to become boringly easy when you're at the halfway point, since most enemies will die with one hit. That said, combat and enemy encounters are only a small part of this whole experience. While a lot of people talk about the combat and the tank controls, one thing that is easy to forget, especially when you consider the direction of the franchise prior to Resident Evil 7, is that the original game is more akin to a point-and-click adventure, where you find objects and use them to solve puzzles. This is why item management is so pivotal to both games, as you have to account for weapons, ammo, healing items, and whatever item you might need to solve any given puzzle. When comparing the two games side by side, there are some puzzles that line up in terms of design, while there are others that are either twists on the original, or subvert the expectations based on what you remember from the original. The layout of the Spencer Mansion, while having some similar areas, deliberately rearranges and adds some new areas to work in the aforementioned Trevor family subplot, as well as throw off veteran players and keep them on their toes. From a pure mechanics standpoint, there isn't really too much to say about the puzzles, since they more or less are the same from playthrough to playthrough, save for a few puzzles that seem to change every so often. One thing the original game has over the remake is how it messes with the order of things between Jill and Chris's campaigns. In Jill's campaign, she has access to the lockpick, which allows her to bypass a number of doors and move through the western part of the mansion more easily. In Chris's campaign, on the other hand, you have to go and find the sword key in order to unlock these doors. This forces you to go in a completely different direction from the outset and risk encountering stronger enemies early on. In the remake, however, both characters have to look for the sword key, with Jill using the lockpick to instead unlock doors to rooms that contain items and kerosene, or puzzle-specific items, as well as creating alternate pathways through the mansion. Chris, on the other hand, has to unlock these doors using old keys, which are scattered throughout the mansion. This is again a mechanic lifted from the original, however, in the original, you didn't really have to use the old keys to unlock items that were important to solve puzzles. It was more or less something you wanted to do if you wanted to find extra ammo or healing items. As a result of this change early on, both characters more or less move through the game in the exact same way, which takes away from some of the variety of their campaigns. Now, I fully acknowledge that nostalgia may be guiding my decision here, since I've played the original game prior to conducting this analysis, whereas this is my first time really going through the remake. And between the extra additions and the similarities between the two campaigns, I'm of the opinion that less is more. While the extra mechanic of the defensive weapons and the Crimson Heads do provide a fresh take on the experience, to me, they feel just like extra bells and whistles that were worked into the game for the purpose of making it different from the original, and as a result, the experience feels kind of padded out. The original, while not having as many features as the remake, is a more straightforward and streamlined experience that moves at a much quicker pace and doesn't overstay its welcome. As such, I'm giving this round to the old. Now, don't get me wrong. I enjoyed the remake, and I like the improvements it made to the story and the atmosphere of Resident Evil. It just feels like they were throwing way too much into this early part of the game with the extra mechanics. The defensive weapons in particular feel like they were added to the game to head off a criticism of the original that wasn't actually made. That said, while the original does move at a better pace, the full motion video sequences and voice acting have not aged particularly well, and are only really remembered for how goofy they are. That said, the original as a game has held up incredibly well over the years, much like the classic horror films from the 1940s. Yeah, it's incredibly cheesy in its presentation between the super serious full-motion video sequences and the laughably bad voice acting, but that's part of the game's charm and is very much in line with the tone of the films that inspired it, particularly those of George A. Romero. That hokey charm gives this game a timeless quality that makes it a compelling time capsule for what gaming was like back in the 90s. That said, the remake is no slouch either. It takes the spooky environments and the survival mechanics that fans love and gives them a serious upgrade while telling a better story overall, the Trevor subplot notwithstanding. It fleshes out the core characters and even improves the overall story of Jill's campaign. This is the kind of remake that most horror film remakes should be striving for, telling the same story, but doing it better. If you want to see the early days of 3D gaming and remind yourself of how far the medium has come, I highly recommend playing the original. If you're looking into getting into the story of the Resident Evil franchise, then the remake is a better starting point, since it's presented in a manner that you can actually take seriously, and at least according to Capcom, is treated as the official canon version of the story. On that note, this clash ends in favor of the Resident Evil remake, the superior version. With that, this episode of MonsterClash draws to a close. Now let me tell you, this clash is where I suffered the most hardship, as whatever entity or force has targeted me seems to have something against Resident Evil. I mentioned in the past how I had footage that had gotten corrupted during production, and it was with this analysis where it occurred. This entity appears to take particular umbrage with Chris Redfield, as the entirety of the opening scene of his campaign, as well as his moments in the Aqua Ring and the Residence, were lost to a miasma of data and code. This was what prompted me to play through the game once more, leading to the discovery of the game's true difficulty. This was disconcerting, to say the least, considering that I had been working on this since July. Fortunately, my good friend Drac was more than gracious enough to offer the footage from his playthrough of the remake that he had recorded with another mutual friend, Aldo. But something weird happened. As he went to retrieve the footage, he found that his playthrough of Resident Evil had also been corrupted, along with the drive in which the footage was housed. Is there something about the remake that does not want to be shown? Or is there some malevolent force engaged in some awful enterprise? I'll not trouble you with my hypothesis, as I must conduct further research. That said, I have much work to do. May we correspond under better tidings, but for now, dear viewer, I bid thee good night.